Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. We are coming to you direct from our studios in Johannesburg. We are on DSTV channel 347, or you can live stream us at Hilaal.tv. Now, last week, Sunday, the 23rd of October, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced some of the actions that he will be taking on the recommendations of the final state capture report. Many, of course, had decided to give up their Sundays at 8 o'clock to listen to the president speaking. And many were hoping that some of the ministers who were featured in the state capture report, or some of the ANC NEC members that were featured in the report, may have been brought to book. But lo and behold, that has still not happened. So the discussion we're having today is, are you as a citizen at this very moment coming to a point where the state capture report feels as if it's just another piece of paper and nothing will be happening? Or are we needing as citizens to bide our time and hope that this will come, if not now, then maybe later? Let me introduce my guests to you to discuss the state capture report and what will happen after the president's speech last week. I have Advocate Stefanie Fick. She is from OUTA, and I have Advocate Paul Hoffman from Accountability Now. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, guys, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening to you, and good evening, Steph.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm going to start off with you, Advocate Fick. When the president, of course, had announced that he was going to speak at 8 o'clock, I know that obviously your organization, OUTA, has been pushing along with Accountability Now, for there to be action taken, especially against ministers who currently occupy the cabinet. Was there a sense of disappointment that it was just another one of those, Sunday night speeches from the president and not really anything, tangible was going to happen?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of disappointment. I think we were all watching the State Capture Commission. There was critics, the fact that the State Capture Commission cost the taxpayers an enormous amount of money. But I do think that we felt that there was some type of accountability because Judge Zondo made quite a few recommendations. And I think what we felt after the president is, despite the fact that he had ample opportunity, it really felt that he just repeated what Judge Zondo said. And what we need, and I think we crave some implementation. We can talk about accountability, we can make examples of accountability, but if we are going to effect change, and if we are going to make sure that state capture never happens, and if we are going to make sure that we eradicate corruption, we need actual plans, not just, yes, I take note of that, but the NPA is busy. I take note of that. There was a lot of criticism against Parliament, the whole cadre deployment, and I don't think we really know what's going to happen with the more serious problems we are facing, and one of them is the sort of redeployment of people, and just the fact that no one is really held accountable.
And we are going to touch on, of course, some of the actions of the recommendations with regards to state-owned enterprises in a bit, cadre deployment being one of them also. Advocate Hoffman, just you're probably sitting there on that Sunday night hoping for something tangible to come. What level of disappointment were you feeling at that moment?
I was profoundly underwhelmed by what the president said. I was waiting for him to say that government was going to dust off the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission report and apply its mind to fixing the electoral system so that the parliament is accountable not to party bosses, but to the people of South Africa. That is a big starting point with everything that is wrong. I was hoping that he would announce that cadre deployment is history. He didn't. He left that alone, although I see subsequently that in his written response, that 76-pager, he has in fact decided to professionalize the public sector, which will mean the end of cadre deployment. He wants, he says, merit and honesty to inform future appointments in the public administration and the state-owned enterprises. And if that happens, it will be the most wonderful new development. But the area in which I experienced the most disappointment on Sunday, the week before last, was in relation to the necessary reform of the criminal justice administration. You know, our Bill of Rights says that we are all equal before the law. And that means that those who have been fingered by the Zondo Commission as requiring investigation or prosecution for their role in state capture should all be brought before the courts for the purpose of prosecuting and punishing them, and especially for the purpose of raking back the loot of state capture. We know that somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion rand, now a trillion has 12 zeros to the left of the decimal point. That's a lot of money to rake back. They boast about finding probably about 10 billion, but that is a mere fraction of what is on the table and ought to be raked back by a competent, effective, efficient, and independent criminal justice administration. And until the political will is mustered to actually put in place a criminal justice administration that has the anti-corruption capacity required in binding terms by the Constitutional Court in its second Glenister judgment, that famous joint judgment of Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke and Justice Cameron. Until those criteria are put in place, which requires the political will to change the law and to capacitate the criminal justice administration, we are going to find ourselves short of the army of prosecutors that the Chief Justice has said will be required to investigate all of the matters that he wants to have investigated. Over 1,400 people and entities have been mentioned as being implicated in those parts of state capture which were actually investigated by the Zondo Commission. And I can tell you that at provincial and municipal level, there are thousands or tens of thousands more that need to be investigated and, if found wanting, prosecuted for their role in state capture. So that, I'm afraid, is something that has not been addressed properly. The idea of turning the ID, the Investigating Directorate of the National Prosecuting Authority, into a permanent body doesn't impress me at all, because if it is done by way of ordinary legislation, then we are back where we were in 2009, when we had scorpions who could do the job and they were closed down by a simple majority in Parliament. That does not meet the secure tenure of office requirement of the Glenister judgment, and it needs to be addressed in a way that does give secure tenure of office. Because if you don't have secure tenure of office, it is very hard to operate without fear, favor, or prejudice, which is the hallmark of an independent corruption buster.
Advocate Hoffman, I want to ask this question too, and I want also the answer from Advocate Fick, which we're going to get for the purpose of time after the break. So here we have a president, and this has been debated on so many platforms, that does he put the party, the ANC, before the Republic of South Africa, or does he put the Republic of South Africa before the interests of the ANC? And I ask this question because this is the same president that has the allegations of pala sitting over his head, of the missing millions of dollars that, of course, was stashed under his bed and just all of a sudden went away. Do you feel that his back is probably against the wall? And I ask this also, another question to it, is that a day before he went ahead and gave his actions of the recommendations. We had former President Jacob Zuma, who's been mentioned so many times in the final state capture report, calling President Ramaphosa, and I quote, a corrupt president. Do you think his back is against the wall?
Yes, I'm afraid he is in a very vulnerable position at the moment, because the ANC is meeting in December to elect its leadership for the ensuing 5 years. Meeting at Nasrec again, and the various factions are jockeying for position at the moment. So the statement by former President Zuma that that Ramaphosa is corrupt and treasonous was the other accusation he made, is all designed to impress the delegates at the meeting in December, and it certainly thwarts the efforts of society to have in place a constitutionally compliant criminal justice administration. Because until we have that, until we have people in place who can operate without fear, favor, or prejudice, which we don't have at the moment, which is why none of the cabinet ministers mentioned in the Zondo Commission recommendations have seen the inside of a courtroom. That will continue until the reform that is required is put in place. And as you know, Accountability Now has been advocating the establishment of a Chapter 9 institution, which we call the Integrity Commission, but you can call it what you like as long as it complies with what the law requires, and the law requires what the Constitutional Court has said is required, and which hasn't been done properly at any stage in South Africa. You need to have specialized, trained, independent, properly resourced personnel who are secure in their tenure of office if you expect equality before the law to be the order of the day, and if you expect your prosecutors to have the spinal fortitude to stand up and go after the powerful, something that does not happen at the moment because the National Prosecuting Authority is fearful and undercapacitated and lacking the skills, the experience, and the resources to mount a complex corruption case.
Advocate Fick, I am going to ask your opinion on the very same question after the break. Do stay tuned to Talking Point, and we'll continue this conversation after the break. Welcome back to Talking Point. We are discussing the state capture report and, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa's actions on the recommendations that were given for that final report by Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Advocate Fick, just your view on the question I'd asked Advocate Hoffman earlier on.
Well, I think if you are, your question that relates to the president is, I think it's quite clear that we are playing party politics. I think it has been for a long time party above sort of South Africa. You've seen it in Parliament. And that is why, like Advocate Hoffman is saying, why it's so important actually that Parliament should have looked at a different electoral system. They had an opportunity to really look at a system that is still, proportional, still majority rules, but that there's a little bit more accountability, making provision for independence, and that you're probably looking at a bit of a constituency-based sort of system. And that is why Parliament is busy, again, with the Bill Act and just doing the bare minimum in order to just be compliant with whatever the Constitutional Court ordered them in the New Nation movement case. But that being said, so on the one hand, I always say, I know that we can't live in this world without politicians, but they are probably just a necessary evil. If you take politics out of a lot of things, I think we will get a whole lot more done, more accountability, et cetera, et cetera. But I have to say that if if we're talking about the Phala matter specifically, you know what was the first thing that came to mind when I read about it and then had the opportunity to read the first affidavit? I hear that there was then consequently amendments to this affidavit. This is political games at its best. Now, I'm not covering for President Ramaphosa. Surely not. I mean, if he's guilty of anything, he should be held accountable. But that affidavit, I mean, I think if I was still part of the prosecution, the prosecuting authority, I would have thrown someone with that docket. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. But that being said, it is investigated. So let's see. You know, if there is something, like I said, the president should be held accountable. I don't think our former president Zuma has got, you know, he can't throw any stones when it comes to corruption. Now, we have a duty in this country to, and I think we really, I want to say we, you know, civil society as well, to start combating corruption. Now, unfortunately, Parliament has also got a way to go. They are you know, there's certain areas where they're getting better, but in other areas, it is still just lacking. And that Parliament had a big hand in state capture and what we saw. So Parliament has got the executive, the constitutional duty to hold to account the executive. And again, you know, their duty is also to, you know, to put South Africa's interest first. They're there to look after me and you. And unfortunately, yet again, it is about party politics. They, you know, so, you know, their constitutional duty, I sometimes wonder if they know what their constitutional duties are, which is extremely important. I think we fought hard enough for democracy and for a constitution. But that being said, you know, they can hold the executive to account in various ways. And, you know, that was also a tragedy about, you know, the speech or the statement that the president made with regards to state capture. I don't think we heard or got the idea of how the current government is going to tackle, you know, corruption. How are they going to eradicate corruption? Again, it's easy to say that, you know, we're going to tackle corruption, but then, you know, you still see ministers that is, although there were serious allegations against them, where did they end up? In Parliament. They are chairpersons or were chairpersons of parliamentary committees. You still see committees that is not taking, you know, holding, for example, a department who is not performing. Every year they must give them a budget and say yes, and vote for a budget. And year after year after year, departments who's not doing their job and is failing in what they're supposed to do just get, you know, another budget. But I just want to end off by saying this. I agree with Advocate Hoffman that it was also very disappointing, you know, to hear about the steps that they're going to take in order to strengthen our NPA. You know, there weren't any steps. You know, how much money are we going to spend on the NPA in order to make sure that there is enough resources, you know, enough prosecutors, that you know, prosecutors aren't prosecuting under a tree, that we get back experience in some of the more serious cases. We must remember that it's not just corruption. Each and every day, we are a country that is struggling with a high crime rate, and every day there's crimes everywhere. So despite the state capture cases and corruption, they also need to deal with crime that is happening each and every day. But, you know, so we didn't hear how we're going to make the NPA better. How is the NPA gonna hold people to account? But I think we also need to understand that there was also not plans for the SAPS. No prosecutor can only prosecute a case that has been investigated by the police. So the independent without political interference, SAPS is also necessary. Otherwise, we are, fighting blind, basically. That being said, I also think that as civil society and as people, we also need to understand that we need to educate. And I think we need to start with our children. We live in a society where it's sort of acceptable to bribe and to be corrupt. I mean, how many people, we joke about the fact that you will give a traffic cop or a policeman lunch or a Coke, or I wonder how many people drive around with enormous amount of money in their cars, how many businesses pay government in order to get tenders. And it's because corruption is always two parties. I equate it to like, drug dealers and drug addicts. A drug dealer will not be able to sell his drugs if there were no drug addicts, if there's no, so the supply and demand, we need to change that. It's going to be hard in the beginning. But, if no one is willing to be corrupt, then a corrupt government will not survive. And I do think that we are also guilty there. Corruption takes two people. And if government is one, who is the other one? And if you take that person, company, whatever, out of the equation, you're going to get closer to combating corruption. I think combating corruption, eradicating corruption is going to really be an effort. Yes, government needs to come to the table, but I think everybody should come to the table. And we need to get rid of this, I am voting in party lines and not in the best interest of South Africa. And let me come back to my original point. People need to understand that the power is in the people to vote for the right people to be in power. And that's why it's so important, I think, that we look at our electoral system and why the statement by the president was so disappointing. Because, we need plans. We don't need just talk and a speech.
Advocate Hoffman, for the purpose of time, I'm going to give you 3 minutes just to answer this question. The independence of our law enforcement authorities, how far are we from that from happening? Because only without the interference of the political will can this happen. Can we see these arrests happening for the people who have been implicated in the state capture report?
Yes, it certainly is one of the criteria set by the Constitutional Court in the Glenister case, that the anti-corruption entity needs to be adequately independent to be able to be effective and efficient in dealing with corruption. Now, that has never been the case in South Africa. It is true that the Scorpions enjoyed some success for a short period, but because they were a creature of an ordinary statute, it was easy to close them down by a simple majority in Parliament, and they were closed down. Now, recreating Scorpions by converting the ID, the investigating directorate of the National Prosecuting Authority, into a permanent body is not going to address the problem. It is almost like the lunacy of repeating what we did before with the Scorpions and expecting a different result in the future with the investigating directorate. What needs to happen is that the prevention, combating, investigation, and prosecution of serious corruption needs to be brought under one roof. There are 87,000 vacancies in the South African Police Service, and many of those vacancies are in the ranks of the Hawks. The Hawks are part of the police structure. They operate and they answer to the Minister of Police, who we know is a suspect in a criminal case about his involvement in those World Cup police headquarters leases at 3 times the going rate. Nobody has got the will to prosecute him for that because he is royal game and enjoys impunity. While there is impunity in South Africa, we will not be able to rest secure in the knowledge that state capture will not happen again. We need that anti-corruption entity to comply properly with the rules of the game that have been laid down by the Constitutional Court and which are binding on the state. As Stephanie said, if you do the bare minimum, you're not going to get the appropriate response. And that is, I think, the most serious and pressing issue in South Africa. Poverty, inequality, unemployment, all relate to our inability to get on top of corruption, which chases away new investment and prevents the creation of new jobs.
Impunity and the SOEs for quite some time was a story of true romance, but true romance that came at a cost to us as citizens. We'll be discussing the SOEs and is there a way for the professionalizing of the public service to be professional, or can there be some flaws to it? After the break, we'll continue the discussion on the state capture report with Advocate Hoffman and Advocate Fick. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm still in conversation with Advocate Stefanie Fick from OUTA and Advocate Paul Hoffman from Accountability Now. We're discussing the state capture report and President Cyril Ramaphosa's actions to be implemented with regards to the findings of the report by the now Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. We heard the President say that with regards to SOEs, that no board member will be involved in procurement processes beyond playing an oversight role. And most importantly, ministers will be prohibited from playing any role in procurement within state-owned enterprises or departments. There was also talk of professionalizing the public sector. Stefanie, I want to bring you into this. Is this something that we as the public, we as the citizens can buy into, given that we have seen so many flaws happen within our SOEs, particularly one that hits us hard at home, that is Eskom?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about SOEs,
Yeah.
it is, I think, it is a bitter pill to swallow. I think it's always, the talk. I'm fascinated by all the plans that we can talk about, and government, sometimes I think they know exactly what the problem is, but what they're talking about, we lack implementation. So obviously we need a professional, professional people in government. We need to professionalize government. One would think that that's obvious, but we really need to we need to find ethical leaders in top positions. We need to find the right people for the right positions. We're talking about SOEs, but you can take any SOE, government, organization, local government, provincial government, national government. The problem is that the right people is not in the right positions. Local government is basically bankrupt. And it's because we're sitting with people in positions that are clearly not up to whatever up to the task. And that is extremely important. So if you are asking me whether professionalizing, civil service is important, I would say yes. Yes, it is absolutely important. But how are we going to achieve this? It is, so yet again, it's the principle is good and we like to hear that. But what are we going to do? We haven't seen any accountability. For example, civil activist organizations like OUTA, we had to take a chairperson of a very big SOE to court to declare her delinquent director, Miss Miyeni. Yes. Why didn't the board, who, if you think about it, in terms of the Companies Act, has got a duty? again, if the right people is not in the right positions, we will see this sort of impunity where no one is held to account. I think what we could learn from state capture is, if you see how that happened, is making sure that now in a different context, the right people is in the right positions. We have beautiful laws in South Africa. I think we have we have a brilliant constitution, but what is lacking is the people working with it. I mean, our constitution can't stand by itself. It needs to be implemented. So where are the flaws? Parliament that is not doing what they're supposed to do. Ministers that interferes into the workings of departments. Members of boards who interferes with executives that are placed in positions where they don't have the right education and do not have the experience to deal with the problems that, for example, an SOE like Eskom is facing. Eskom, and the fact that we are currently struggling with load shedding, can be directly related to state capture. The fact that we did not do any maintenance, the fact that the right people were not put in charge of Eskom. It's a specialized field. It's not just an SOE that gives us energy. There's a whole lot of things that go into making sure that an SOE like Eskom is functioning. And who gets the brunt of this? Us as normal people. But I want to add this. We complain about load shedding, and we have a right to complain about load shedding. But we also have families and people in South Africa that still do not have electricity. There are still people in the country that do not have water. We complain about the fact that, our water ain't clean. There are people who do not have running water. Why? Because, we get the money in, but how we spend the money still needs some loving care, because I firmly believe, I don't know if Advocate Hoffman will agree with me, I think there's enough money in our fiscus. Although we have a very small taxpayer base, got enough money in the fiscus. We just need to learn how to spend it on the right stuff. We waste an enormous amount of money on the salary bill. Again, it's an unnecessarily big salary bill. We just, in the public space, we discussed the fact that ministers all of a sudden get electricity for free. Thank goodness that they overturned that. But I think we need to look at that ministerial handbook, because if we think about the circumstances we are currently living in, maybe it is really time to look at all the perks of ministers. Do we need the amount of ministers we have? And all of that leads to, why an SOE like Eskom is in trouble. And unfortunately, we're going to struggle with load shedding for quite a while. This is not a ship that you turn around, in minutes and seconds. It's going to take some work. And in the meantime, all they ask for is that civil society should be patient. I sometimes wonder how long that patience is going to last. Because I do not think as a country we deserve that.
100%. I don't think any of the citizens deserve what is currently happening in our country right now. Advocate Hoffman, you earlier on said about the importance of the professionalizing of the public sector. But let's just say you have somebody who is a board member of an SOE or a minister who decides, well, we don't really care about professionalizing the SOEs. We just want to go ahead and, as they say, eat the big cake that's there. That's a challenge, isn't it? To anyone who wants to try and make sure that, SOEs are run the right way, the way it's supposed to be run.
Yes, I think that the government is alive to the problem you're now raising. And it really is a question of Parliament coming to the party and putting its best foot forward, initiating legislation that regulates and governs the professionalization of the public sector and monitoring the implementation of that legislation. If that had been done when the Hawks and the NPA parted ways, with the Hawks doing investigation of corruption and the NPA doing prosecution of corruption, you would have found that Parliament years ago would have been asking ministers and leaders of the NPA to account for the lack of prosecutions of people involved in serious corruption. Hasn't happened. On the state-owned enterprises side, you're going to have to accept that there are more than 700 state-owned enterprises at the moment, and many of them do not deserve to exist and should be closed down. I think that if that is done, you will be able to streamline the state-owned enterprise sector quite extensively. There are some things that should be done by the government and not by the private sector, but privatization is an option that is not acceptable ideologically to the governing alliance, but ought to be looked at. They're clearly changing their ideology. If they're getting rid of cadre deployment, they're going to have to consider changing their ideology in other ways. They can look to the example of Singapore, which was an impoverished swamp at the beginning of the 1960s, and today is one of the most successful countries in the world. And the way they did that was to do their decision-making on the basis of pragmatism rather than ideology, to employ people on merit, both in the state-owned enterprises and in the public administration, as well as in Parliament. The people in the Parliament of Singapore are not idle slackers who have been put there to swell the ranks of voting cattle. If you do that, merit, honesty, and pragmatism, those are brought to bear in South Africa, we will find ourselves with a very slimmed down state-owned enterprise sector. We will find ourselves with professionals who are honestly doing the job in the interest of the people of South Africa, rather than for the purpose of exploiting the public purse for corrupt ends. To get to that point, laws are going to have to be changed. Parliament is going to have to be involved and muscular, and we are going to have to monitor the implementation of correct changes to the law in order to make the professionalization a reality in South Africa.
Well, we are going to wrap up the conversation after the break with Advocate Paul Hoffman and Advocate Stefanie Fick. Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. This is a question for both Advocate Fick and for Advocate Hoffman. On the show, we always talk about the 2024 elections and what a penultimate elections that's going to be. I want to put this question to you first, Advocate Hoffman. How much does the actions of this final state capture report, and when I mean actions, the actions of seeing those responsible being held accountable, how much does this hinge on what will happen come 2024 and when those elections do happen?
That's a nice, difficult question. Because if you accept that the president is being serious when he says he'd rather fall on his sword than betray the ANC, and if you accept, as Zuma has made very clear in the past, that to the leadership of the ANC, the party is more important to them than the state, then we are going to get into 2024 with a great number of voters who are unhappy with the governing alliance with the ANC and its partners. And that could make for a very different outcome in the results of the election. I think that the ANC is alive to this. Before President Ramaphosa became its leader, this is now in 2017, it was polling in its own polls 40% of the voters in South Africa. His personal popularity moved them from 40 to the 57 that they won in the last general election. Now, the truth is that Mr. Ramaphosa has not been a successful president. He has the parlor baggage. He has faction fighting within his own party with previous presidents attacking him, not only allegations of corruption and treason from Zuma, but also some pointed questions from Thabo Mbeki. So he is in a weakened position and is unlikely to be able to swing 17% of the voters into the ANC camp in the future. So unless there is some radical reform from the ANC side between now and 2024, such as the introduction of a Chapter 9 anti-corruption commission, there will be a perception among voters that the ANC is not serious about countering corruption, is not serious about capacitating the criminal justice administration to deal with corruption appropriately. And this will drive supporters away from the ANC, either into the wilderness where they won't vote at all, or into the arms of the burgeoning opposition ranks where we see a new party mushrooming each week at the moment.
Advocate Vic, your final comments on this? Advocate Vic?
Sorry, now my unmute,
yeah.
This unmute button that's...
No, it's not a problem. Advocate Vic, just your final comments on the question I asked Advocate Hoffman to close off the show.
You know what? I think that political parties needs to be learned a lesson. And I think that voters need to understand in the build-up to the elections in 2024 that they have the power, and that there's a lot of political parties that will have to pull up their socks in order to get the votes. I think we've seen with the ruling party that people are starting to realize that it is it is their fault that there's no movement. People aren't getting the electricity that they were promised. Like I've said, local government is in an absolute mess, and it is. People are feeling this on their skin. We have an unemployment rate that is going through the roof. Government should not be in the business of getting or making or creating jobs. What they should do is creating the environment where business can flourish. We need, in the 2024 elections, we will need a party that will create jobs, that will make sure, a government that is professional, that will make sure that we create an environment where business can flourish, where we can get investment in South Africa, and that we can really, create a better future for our kids. That is what we all want. But it's really to create a better South Africa for all. We are going through some very tough times, and it's not just South Africa. I think internationally, economically, it's not going well. And but South Africa is resilient, and I think as a nation we deserve an election where the party that eventually get the votes will really fight for the people and not for themselves. I think what we have seen is that it's a fight for resources of South Africa and not to create a better South Africa for all. And I think voters has started to show, especially the ruling party, that we are fed up. We are not going to stand for this. I think that there was a warning in the local government elections. So, on the road to 2024, I'm looking forward to hearing all the promises. That's typical political parties. And I'm looking forward to all the promises and what they're going to do in order to create a better South Africa for all. But I think we're past that. This is now about actions. And how are you going to hold the people to account that, is stealing, defrauding, corruption? What are you actually going to do in order to curb corruption in South Africa, who is causing an enormous amount of, I want to say illness. Everything that is wrong in South Africa, you can basically take back to corruption. Our health system is falling apart. Corruption. The tenders are not given to the people that can do the job. And so I can go on. So I think on the road to 2024, I think voters are going to realize they do have the power to put into power someone that will look at the best interest of each and every citizen of South Africa.
Advocate Stefanie Fick, Advocate Paul Hoffman, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us here tonight on Talking Point. We really do appreciate it.
You're
welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. That was Advocate Stefanie Fick from Outer, Advocate Paul Hoffman from Accountability Now, discussing the state capture report, President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech on the 23rd of October, and of course the actions to those recommendations. What happens now with regards to that? That's all we have for you here on Talking Point. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team, we say Jazakallah. We will see you again, same time, same place next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.